Diaspora, actually, the word itself is Greek by origin, although wasn't that commonly known because it was so closely associated with the Jewish experience that people thought it might be ancient Hebrew, but in fact that's not true. The word derives from two Greek words, basically to throw or to scatter seed. So you can imagine perhaps a farmer walking down a field with a whole lot of seed in his hand and throwing it out. And so that does give that sense of people scattering. And it came actually into the Jewish experience of Aya, the translation, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, where the word diaspora was used and then entered the English vocabulary that way. That original word of scattering seeds is still quite potent.
I know there are a number of people, I'm thinking particularly of Rogers Brubaker,
right,
but also people like Kim Butler, who wrote in the journal Diaspora. A number of people like that who have tried to abstract particular characteristics, and William Safran, of course, who's coming here
right,
next week, was one of the ones to do that. Yeah. Some of them have argued that that key characteristics would be dispersion, identity maintenance or boundary maintenance over a long period of time, and orientation towards a homeland. Any of those key characteristics?
I think that's a very good summary. That it's dispersion, movement certainly at the very least. Dispersion implies, of course, movement in multiple directions. Group identity, the continuation, and a link with homeland. I think those are the core ones. But I think that description of that core is very good in the context of saying what is a diaspora as opposed to migration in general or migrants in general. Mm-hmm. But I would counsel students not to be too reductionist. In other words, you can get those three simple characteristics. You can list them and say, okay, that's my definition of diaspora, that's fine. But as soon as you get into the complexity of the cases, then you suddenly are saying, I need a little bit more. So if you like to put it this way, you can have a reductionist or a simplified version of the diaspora, those three, and you could have an elaborated version. And I think Bill Safran and I have in particular been associated with listing a set of common features which elaborate those three. I think I ended up with 8 or 10 or 12, and he perhaps 1 or 2 more. But it doesn't really matter, again, that you don't have to adopt these too literally. It's just that when you start probing a particular diaspora, let us say, for example, the connection to homeland. You then take a particular case and say, well, let's think about the Sikhs. Well, they never achieved a homeland. They aspired to a homeland. They would like to have at one point had a homeland, although that aspiration seems to be fading. At one point there was a militant campaign by Sikh separatists to create a Sikh homeland. But are they then not a diaspora? Are they only part of the Indian diaspora? Is the homeland significant or not significant in that case, or how significant? Of course, homelands can be virtual homelands. They can be imaginary homelands. A lot of Africans in the New World talked about Ethiopia, but Ethiopia was an imaginary homeland. It was something that they derived from the biblical understanding. It wasn't their real homeland, which was more likely to be in West Africa. So all of these characteristics, they need unpacking. Those three original characteristics need unpacking. They need to be made more complex as you delve into particular cases, particular examples, particular comparisons. So don't be scared of getting too complex. On the other hand, if you want to boil it down to the essential definitions, as Alan said, those three are it. That's it, yeah.
And you were talking there for a little bit about homeland, and
yeah,
that's something I wanted to talk with you more about.
Yeah.
People say that one of the important and interesting things about the concept of diaspora is that it makes us think differently about the relationship between identity and place.
Right.
what do you think it is about diasporas and about the concept of diaspora that makes us think about that relationship differently? What is it?
Yeah. Well, this is a very good question, because in a way my answer is probably more conservative than most people's answer, but let's give you what my answer might be. It seems to me home and homeland are somewhat different. Homeland does imply some kind of territorial space that one can call one's own or identify as one's own. Very often, of course, that homeland is supported by immense mythology, and fabulation and extraordinary kinds of notions that are not absolutely historically valid. I mean, for the Armenians, well, it's obvious, isn't it? It's the original place where man was refashioned, because that's where Noah's Ark landed, on the top of Mount Ararat, and that's right in the middle of Armenia. So, of course, all humanity started in Armenia. I've already alluded to the Ethiopian case, which, of course, has very interesting echoes because of the connection between ancient Ethiopia and ancient Israel. So there's a land, there's a territory, even if that territory might be somewhat, let's say, imagined, in the same way as in that famous Benedict Anderson's book, Imagined Communities, one can imagine imagined homelands. But I would say a lot of scholars, some geographers, some postmodernist scholars, some literary scholars, have taken this argument very, very much further. And so they have suggested that one can render home or homeland in a much more abstract kind of way. And probably the most early example of this was Avtar Bra's book, Cartographies of Diaspora. Not a lot of the book deals with this, but there are a few crucial passages that are often cited when she basically argues that home can be where you settle as well as where you come from. So in an extraordinary way, she appropriated diasporic concept to people who, in fact, did not aspire to go back to an original homeland and had no strong association with that, but who had a home that, if you like, was an ethnic home, or a home of a feeling warm and a space where you felt comfortable.
It's almost a second home.
Almost a second home, or home is where the heart is, would be another kind of popular way of expressing it. So diaspora, in this more imaginative use, then became a term that really rather excited artists, poets, writers, and so on, who wanted to create diasporic art, but in the places to which they settled rather than from which they came. So there would be echoes of their homeland, but there would be no direct connection. So I say people have to be a little bit wary of that more imaginative use, but go with it. If you like it, go with the flow. But it's certainly something that has been very much picked up on the humanities and artistic side. One takes a term and deploys it if it has a use to you, if it's saying something to you. And diaspora is suggestive, and it does definitely work when discussing post-colonial literature. You have that echo of that past, even if the past is not quite a political project anymore, or is actually not a political project anymore. It's something like a cultural affirmation. It's to do with complexity and the complexity of identity. And of course that's what artists, poets, writers are particularly good at expressing.
I'm glad you raised the point of diasporas as a political project, because I wanted to ask, what do you think's the policy importance?
I think it's enormous, and of course very surprising, because when I was doing this stuff in the 1990s, and so I think this is true of Bill Safran as well, the idea of any policy implication was completely alien to us. We just were doing it out of intellectual curiosity, genuine intellectual curiosity. We were trying to develop a way of understanding a complex reality, essentially because migrants didn't seem to be going on one-way flows from place A to place B, then settling and then adopting new identities, new citizenships, and new cultures and singular loyalties. They seem to be carrying multiple loyalties. So we were doing it as an intellectual project, and now, quite suddenly, I think, let's say about 5-6 years ago, but accelerating, it's become a really important applied field, and Alan is, of course, a very important figure in that. I mean, I'd say, let's say there are threefold examples. One, diaspora engagement policy. States who have previously lost populations, sometimes they were totally neglectful of those populations who went abroad. The Chinese emperor at one point was interrogated by a Californian visitor who said, you know, we've got quite a few Chinese in California, and he just waved his hand and said, oh, that flotsam and jetsam, they're nothing, you know, they're nothing to us. They were actually seen as traitors, or as people who betrayed the country, or who illustrated the country was weak when they could be taken off as indentured labourers or so on. So people were ashamed, states were often ashamed of them. Now, states want to get hold of them. They're desperate to get hold of them because these populations are sources of influence in their places of settlement. They're sources of remittances, they're sources of investment income, of technological progress. They are enormously important. And so, I mean, you know, we're very, very aware here, and Alan is, of course, is very, very aware of this, of the many countries who are now trying to create diaspora engagement policies and set up their own ministries to further that. So that's the first applied area. The second applied area that I think is very, very important is that states who want to try and penetrate through aid and investment, or try to help countries, are now very wary of giving it to governments on the grounds of corruption, or perhaps the governments themselves are rather unsavoury, and so they see diaspora groups as ways of channeling aid. So they will meet with a group of diasporic group living in London who happen to be from Ghana, and they will route aid, investment, support and so on through that group. It goes directly to the family, and it's seen as a superior, or the families or the communities, is seen as superior to government aid, where it gets creamed off all along the way. Now, of course, this is a bit of an ideal model. You know, obviously it doesn't always work out in practice. And the third area, I think, of applied or policy area is a slightly more sinister one, which is to say a number of countries are now very wary of diasporas because they see diasporas as harbouring dual identities. So somebody who has a loyalty to their place of settlement, but also a loyalty to their place of origin, or to a wider loyalty to, let's say, a transnational community like the Muslim Ummah, the international community that links Muslims together. And so the applied field in that case is to do with security. How do you police diasporas? How do you win their loyalties? How do you ensure that they are not subversives or likely to drop a bomb in the nearby underground station? So those three areas, there are other areas as well, but those three areas have become very, very important policy areas at the moment. And I mean, you know, they are now very salient on the agendas for many countries.
I'm just thinking of one of your influential papers, the one Diasporas and the Nation State, From Victims to Challengers. Reminds me a lot of the comment you were just making about security, and you know, there's something quite profound going on there when states are starting to feel threatened by transnational flows and movements, feeling that their power is threatened, and it connects with something, you know, right back in the roots of theories of government, of theories of legitimate government. You know, Hobbes' statement, "Man can't serve two masters." And yeah, I think you're right that there's a sense diasporas give policymakers and governments the sense that people are trying to serve two masters.
It gives them a headache. That's definitely the case. I mean, the simplest model, which, you know, the simplest nationalist would have is one race, one space, one government. That's it. You know, it's hot. Now, of course, it's a joke. You can't find any place like that. Even
If
you
you ever could. Yeah.
Well, perhaps if you ever could, maybe in, you know, Iceland for a bit or somewhere like that, or you know, Mali or something like that. But now you really can't. I mean, you really just. I mean, there is no place on earth that has that singular ethnic identity, that singular language, that singular sense of ethnic identity. And so, as these identities become more multiple, more complex, and so on, states have to try and figure out a way of managing that. Sometimes they don't do that very well, and they oscillate quite dramatically between policies of recognizing difference, multiculturalism being one such phrase, or of suppressing difference, where they think it's got too far and too far out of hand. And in Europe particularly, we're in a stage of suppressing differences at the moment. But these things are cyclical. They go backwards and forwards and, you know, over the years. So that's another applied field in a sense, is how do you manage diversity?
Absolutely, yeah. Why do you think it is now that every country in the world is experiencing diversification? I mean, it's one thing to say, well, there's more migration. I think if we look statistically, actually probably the proportion of migrants in the world has actually stayed fairly similar. So against that background, why is it that suddenly it's become more important, and people's connections to far off places, why have they suddenly become thicker and more important?
Well, I mean, you know, we have a mutual friend in Steve Vertevec who's coined this expression super diversity, and you're quite right in saying the actual proportion of migrants was very, very high at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, and then it dipped with the Depression and the two World Wars, and only really begins to go up again in the 1980s and 90s, and now it is reaching and perhaps exceeding the 19th, 20th century one. So the two big peaks separated by 100 years. But the difference that Vertevec drew our attention to, which I think is right, is it wasn't a small number of places going to a small number of places, a small number of people from a small number of places going to a small number of destinations. Now you've got these multiple crisscross things. You really do have lots of small groups going to lots of different places. And so in a way that conforms more to the diaspora logic, doesn't it, because of this idea of dispersal. So when there's a demonstration against a tyrannical or unjust regime in, let's say right now as we talk, in Syria, who pops up? But, you know, quite a number of Syrians who are living in London, who are standing outside the Syrian embassy, and the same in Amsterdam, where the Syrians living there pop up, and now, and I'm sure that happens too in New Zealand. And so you're suddenly aware that there are very large numbers of groups, not necessarily in total all that massive, but very great deal of diversity between groups, and go into unexpected places. So not necessarily from your colonial empire, not necessarily from the nearby local and contiguous state, not necessarily from the place where you had most economic relationships with, but from anywhere. And this, of course, has something to do with connectivity and what people loosely describe as globalization, because it's much more easy to work along the circuits. Or you can move. I think I'm not maybe right in saying that most places can be reached in 18 hours.
Perhaps not New Zealand.
I think it's just in there. I think New Zealand's in there. I think this is the measurement from Heathrow. Everywhere on Earth can be reached in 18 hours.
And just picking up on the super diversity point, it's when you have these small groups of people from lots of different places, the kind of the sense of solidarity, or what people once, in a way that's possibly not any longer politically correct, called social cohesion, isn't really there. And so the sense of solidarity that many small groups have derives from their place of origin, the place that they left, and the fact that they've got these, much more advanced information, communication, travel technologies, allows them to retain that sense of solidarity, even when they're living in that really.
I mean, I think that's right. I think although the qualification I would add is they retain what they brought with them, to be sure, but they also invent new things where they are. So where they came from is a resource. It's deployed as a cultural resource. Nigerians living in London are not very Nigerian, but they can evoke certain foods, certain habits, certain customs, certain religious observances from home, reinvent them to some degree, and quite often creolise or mix and match them with the local population or with groups from their own country with whom they really didn't have very much to do. So people who were separated in sub-ethnic groups come to London, and suddenly they're all Nigerian, so they may discover their Nigerianness in London rather than in Nigeria. So there's something complex going on there. It's not just a simple reproduction of what happens back home, but a much more complex reordering, refashioning, social construction of an ethnic identity.
I'm glad you raised that, because I wanted to ask you about that, and we talked a little bit beforehand, about this. There's a difference, I think, there's been some debate in diaspora studies between this social realist idea of diasporas as a sort of real existing group that you can go out there and find, and the social constructionist idea that, diasporas are groups with an identity that's, in a sense, fabricated or strategically deployed for political reasons. I wonder if you could just sort of reflect on that difference and see what you think the difference is. And
this is a very, very important debate, and it's difficult to get to it very directly without just saying just a couple of words by way of preface about what theories of knowledge do in the social sciences. And I guess the easiest way to do it is to say that there are some people who are loosely described as positivists who believe there's a reality out there, and what we need to do is discover that reality. We can't always apprehend it because it's complex, or it may remain hidden to us, except if we develop our techniques better, our instruments, our research instruments, our statistical instruments included. So gradually we'll get hold of that reality and begin to discern it more and more. And then on the other side, as you say, the social constructionists, and just a footnote to our students, don't confuse it with social constructivists, which is a slightly different thing used in education by Piaget and other crowds, but the social constructionists who say actually reality is fashioned in interaction. So the social constructionist will distinguish between pure subjectivism, which is just a personal view on things, pure objectivism or positivism or realism on the one, and in the middle they would find social constructionism. And I'm sympathetic to social constructionist arguments. And indeed, as you suggested, I've just used the social constructionist argument to describe how ethnic groups, to some degree, manufacture what they have, or reorder what they have once they're in. But I think the real danger is that students love this stuff so much that they just go to town on social constructionism. And what I would do is just say, put a little warning flag in there and say, don't overdo it. In the Nigerian example, Nigerians in London example, there is something that they draw on in constructing their identity. There are some social practices which are real in Nigeria. There is some language that they're drawing on which is real. There is some citizenship that is real. So what I would say is the social constructionist logic can be overdone, because people then say, oh, there's absolutely nothing there, it all has to be fashioned in social interaction. Now, there is something there. It's not that there's nothing there, it's that the particular framing and shape and coherence of that something has to be drawn together in social behaviour, in social interactions, as a political project. That's very important in diaspora studies. You see, so when we go right back to that threefold simple discussion, I would say here's a good example where we need to add another complexity, which is to say, how do people create a continuity of ethnic identity? What organizations and associations are doing that? What are their political projects? So we have to see this as manufactured to some degree, but not manufactured from nothing. It's not, we're not God who just has some dust and creates some world. What we've got is we've got a whole assembly of things. What we do is we create different repertoires from existing things. That's how I'd use social constructionism.
That's a fascinating way to discuss it and describe it. Just in Beirut recently, in Nick Van Heer's talk, he was talking about an idea that he had raised earlier in our Impacts of Diaspora seminar, the idea of a dormant diaspora or latent diaspora. And I remember at the time there was a lot of discussion around that, the sort of the problematic, possibly essentialist underpinnings of this idea of a latent diaspora. But the way we were talking about it in Beirut was, you know, there are certain axes of similarity, certain shared characteristics that people have that may not be highlighted in some contexts at all. You may not realize that you share a particular characteristics with somebody, but then you shift places and all of a sudden that shared characteristic becomes central to your identity, and that's when it becomes somehow mobilized.
That's right. That's right. No, I absolutely concur with that. The mobilization, that process of mobilization, is where we could do a lot more refined, careful work of how is it that these little shared characteristics which remained latent or dormant become active and engaged. And that process, I think, needs a lot of work.
Fascinating. So some people say that diaspora as a concept has run its course, and I'm not one of them. I would be very interested to hear what you think is still useful in the term in response to those kinds of criticisms.
Well, look, I mean, certainly if you want to make a statistical judgment, it has not run its course. Because, I've done this little exercise, which is every few years I look at the Library of Congress, which is the biggest library in the world, I believe, and look at the number of titles published on the word diaspora, and, it just goes up exponentially every few years. So certainly people are writing about diaspora. They see it as a useful word. There are quite a number of journals in which diaspora appears as a title or a subtitle. There are more and more articles with that thing. So people are using it. I suppose the real issue is, has it become attenuated to such a degree that it actually has lost any of its bite, where people are using it so casually, so without thought, that it's just become a sort of walking down the road talking about, your friend type of term. Oh, how's that diaspora doing? Or have you seen that movie about the Italian diaspora? Or in other words, it's become too casual and it's lost its bite. Now, I think there is something to that argument, and it's a very delicate balance between, on the one hand, saying, look, you don't want to be a roadblock in the standing in front of people who want to use it creatively and in new directions. But on the other hand, I think you do need to just say that's just too banal, that you just missed it. It can't just be a complete synonym for migrant. It's got to be something more than that. In other words, I think it should be something of a provocation. It should be something that has a sort of feeling that, why is he calling me a diaspora? Why is she calling me a diaspora? What's going on there? This is creating some anxiety or unease, in which, a question is asked. Is it right that Mexicans are a diaspora in the United States, or wrong? In Palestinian case, Edward Said, a great Palestinian scholar, wonderful person, who now dead sadly, resisted the word diaspora. He said, no, we don't want that Jewish term, you know. But then now it's become common, and yet in a curious way it's very political, because it actually makes that point that I made earlier on. The Palestinian diaspora resulted from the Israeli diaspora returning, and the actual evocation of that word, although it carries that Greek/Jewish connotation, which led Said to resist it at first, actually has huge potency for the argument, because you're able to undermine the credibility of the Israeli case.
Yeah, so it's a very charged word in many ways, isn't it? I mean, there's the whole the victimhood aspect to it. So you know, it's sort of denoting people, a group as a diaspora, suggests that they share a common trauma, and that leads to the question of blame. Who's responsible for the trauma? You know, in the case of the Jews and the Palestinians, that's obviously, you know, essentially relevant. But also, I think going back to what we were talking earlier about the states using the word, it's also something that, you know, because it conjures up the idea of connection and orientation towards a homeland.
Right.
It suggests obligation on either side. You're our people, and we're your state. Your primary connection is with us, the homeland. So I think that's one of the reasons why states find it so relevant and useful, because they can, you know, there are migrants out there. Some of them are ours, and we have obligations to them, and we'll, you know, act benevolently towards them. But they also have obligations towards us, and so
a threat for one state, also an opportunity for another, because you want to link your diaspora to your state, but that state to whom you're directing those questions say, oh, you can't come here and say all these people are yours. So there's a tug of loyalty, a tug of war.
That's right.
And I mean, you say it's politically charged. Just last month we had a vote in the French Parliament to declare anybody who make illegal a declaration that the Armenian massacres were not genocide. So in other words, a denial clause. So this was definitely action by the Armenian diaspora in France, who've been lobbying for many, many years for recognition of what had happened to them in the period just turn of the 19th and 20th century. The Turkish government was absolutely furious, cut off all contracts to the French, you know, and so on. So these are very, very potent things. One word can just switch something like that. So I think as long as diaspora has that bite, it's not irrelevant. I think that's a really strong argument. And you know, the example you just gave of the Armenians being able to place pressure on policymakers in France and equally in the United States for many years is an indication of how this kind of tug of war over the loyalties of diasporas in some periods works in favour of the migrants or the diasporas themselves, but probably in other periods they kind of get crushed between the two. Exactly.
You know, you alluded before to you know, there being sort of an ebb and flow in you know, in how accepted diversity is. And I think in a period where diversity is accepted, migrants can use these dual loyalties, and I know this is something you've written about, as a resource. They can play the two sides off against each other. But in a period when, you know, diversity is less valued, the spectre of dual loyalties is something that needs to be eradicated and squashed out, and so anybody who appears to have them is in a very dangerous position, actually.
Very dangerous, exactly. Remember the Chinese and the Japanese who were interned in California during the Second World War, precisely because the thought they had, well, these guys could be enemy aliens. This is the fifth column.
Whereas now, you know, it's all access to policy and
absolutely.
and influence. So there's a huge amount of diaspora research going on at the moment. I wanted to ask you what themes and currents you find most interesting. We talked just a little bit about, you know, the idea of how diaspora identity is mobilised, but maybe if you could give some more examples and thoughts there.
Okay, so I suppose we'll do this as a kind of little wrap up, just to see where we think this is going. Look, I think there's going to be a lot more of the same. People will work through this concept in particular contexts, in particular areas. They will rework some of the data and so on. So I don't think that there's going to be a huge change in terms of the history of diasporas and the looking at particular examples of it. Where I think we could find some extra work is where we hinted at already, that the way in which diasporas become mobilized, that kind of, those points of connection, how networks, how political parties or social movements, how governments are mobilized, and whether they're successful, and why are they successful. All of that, I think, needs quite a lot more work. I think that's clear. Where I think the term is growing, and perhaps in that slightly anxious sense growing to the point of attenuation, is in the humanities. And in a way I think the social sciences and history are on steady state, maybe growing slightly, but where it's really just exploding is in the humanities. And where I see a lot of kind of slightly wild work but interesting work is in the whole area of experiencing diaspora or performing diaspora or creating diaspora. And so companies, theatre companies, for example, who create diaspora theatre, or artists who paint diaspora art. I was in touch with one just recently, actually, and we've got a big new exhibition, the Tate Modern in London, called Migration and I think migration and art, which I think is very strong on these themes. And so this whole sense in which mobilization is a subjective as well as a collective enterprise. And that's, I think, where a lot of the work is going. And I notice really creative artists beginning to grab this concept and run with it.